Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Beth Mattingly, Director of Research on Vulnerable Families at the Carsey Institute, and want to welcome you. This is the first in a new research seminar series that we're putting together for the campus. As you probably know, this semester's focus is on poverty and place. And before I introduce Mill, I want to remind you of the two forthcoming lectures in this series. On October 14th, Dan Lichter from Cornell University is going to come and speak with us about American diversity and emerging patterns of racial and ethnic segregation. And then on November 18th, Elizabeth Kneebone is going to join us from the Brookings Institution to talk about her new book with Alan Berube titled Confronting Suburban Poverty, where they went out and interviewed people in suburban communities across the country and also looked at a variety of data sources to see what the landscape of suburban poverty is like and how that has changed. So she'll be here on the 18th to share that with you. And there are some more details available on our website if you are interested. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Mill Duncan back to campus today. She's going to discuss her update to her groundbreaking book, Worlds Apart. She's an expert on both rural poverty and changing rural communities and brings a breadth of experience to understanding the lives of the poor and the role that place-specific histories, politics, and circumstances play in influencing individual lives. As many of you know, Mill has a long history at UNH, both as a sociology professor and as founding director of the Carsey Institute. Currently, she is research director of AGREE, a new initiative to transform food and agriculture policy. And in addition to authoring Worlds Apart, Mill has written numerous book chapters and articles and received her doctorate degree from the University of Kentucky in sociology and is a recipient of the Thomas Ford Distinguished Alumni Award from that university's Department of Sociology. So, welcome, Mill.
Hello, good friends. It's nice to see everybody. I want to thank the Carsey Institute for hosting this and also for their support of my update, and Sally Ward and Michelle Dillon and Leslie Hamilton for the help reading early drafts of the update. I thought I'd review a little bit of what I found 20 years ago and then tell you how things have changed. 20 years ago, partly inspired by William Julius Wilson's work in the 1980s in Chicago, I set out to look at two persistently poor rural communities where poverty was extremely high, an Appalachian coal-dependent area and a Mississippi plantation community down in the Mississippi Yazoo Delta. And I also, for comparative purposes, went to northern New England mill town where poverty was not so high. And in these places, with the wonderful help of some really brilliant sociology graduate students, and in the case of Mississippi, help from a colleague at Rust College, Gemma Beckley, we interviewed hundreds of people and put together an analysis of what was going on, and then I told that analysis in Worlds Apart through the lives of individuals and through quotes from them. And I wanted to understand both the persistence of poverty, but also the obstacles to change when I undertook this work. And my conclusion was that the absence of a middle class, the fact that these poor communities had haves and have-nots and no middle class, was undermining community institutions that were crucial for upward mobility for the poor. And what we found there was that the poor were socially isolated. They went to different schools and different churches, and they didn't mix with the middle class in a social way, and so they were not prepared to escape poverty, not prepared for the mainstream, as Bill Wilson would have said. But also, and I think a lot of people have found this to be one of the unique things about what we found and what this analysis showed, we found corrupt politics. We found that no one was holding accountable the public sector or the private sector employers for how they distributed opportunity and resources. And people were involved in both of the poor communities with their own families. They didn't do community-wide things. They looked out for their own families, whether they were poor or part of the haves. And people in Appalachia would distinguish the two groups as those who work and those who draw. One person said to us, and then there's the people who don't want to work at all, never have and never will. We call them the first of the monthers because they come out of the hollows with about 10 kids and they just draw food stamps and stuff like that. They live like that, and I guess that's the way they want to live. Or one poor woman said to us, there are the good rich people and the bad poor people. In the Delta, of course, historically, people have always attributed the poverty in Appalachia to the iron grip of the coal companies and the poverty in the Delta to racism and segregation. But one of the things that I found 20 years ago was that there were a lot of similarities between what was going on with the poor and with the communities that they lived in Appalachia and in the Delta. In the Delta, the haves were the wealthy plantation owners and then the shop owners and merchants and professionals who kind of acted as lieutenants to those wealthy plantation owners. And the have-nots were the large, poor black majority, vulnerable and very dependent. One white waitress said to me, if one of the blacks was to piss Jimmy off, he could make it hard on the boy, get him fired. See, over here, the blacks don't have the opportunities that whites does. They're really disgraded. So 20 years ago, 35% of the people in the coal county were poor. 60% of the people in the Delta were poor. 80% of blacks lived in poverty. And family names really mattered in these communities. In Blackwell, the coal community, people said, you hear someone's last name and before you meet them, you've already got the idea they're a good person or they're as sorry as can be. Someone else said, you have to come from the right family around here. If you've got a rich name, they'll take you. Otherwise, you can't find work. And in the Delta, one black man told us, if you colored and you got money, white people will talk to you. If you ain't got no money, all they want to hear is yes, sir, and no, sir. Everyone in these two poor communities could name the handful of families who run things, the powerful local operators and merchants in Appalachia and the big plantation owners in the Delta. These families who ran things could block new businesses from coming in that might dilute their power. They could blackball an individual who didn't follow the rules or even voted wrong. You have to be careful here. You don't want enemies, especially if you don't have importance. If they blackball you, you won't even flip a hamburger. One person in the Delta said, these farmers will cut you out and they will run you out of town. In both places, there was vote buying and intimidation of voters by these families that run things and the people who worked with them. And people would lose their jobs. One man who was working at a public agency ran against one of the white plantation owners for a county supervisor role and lost by just a few votes. And when he went back to get his job back, he was told that that wasn't going to be possible because if he were rehired, the agency wouldn't get any funds because they needed to punish them for letting him run, for him having run. So it was a very complete grip that the families who ran things had, the political corruption that ran throughout both places. The public schools in both places were chaotic and even dangerous. In Dahlia, the Delta community, there were cuttings, there were even high school students were paddled. Whites sent their kids to a white academy, and they put a lot of their kind of social and civic energy into maintaining that academy. In the coal community, there was an independent county seat school, and that's where all the professionals sent their kids. And actually, statewide, it did very well and sent a lot of kids to school, on to college. So life was family-based and church-based, and families and churches were divided by social class and in the Delta by race. In contrast, this more diverse, prosperous paper mill community in northern New England was not divided. In fact, people made a big point of saying that it wasn't divided. They said that people lived the same life, went to the same sports events, had camps in the woods, all hunted and fished. One guy described playing broom hockey in the street with people who made twice what he did and people who made half what he did. Hospital lunch tables were an array of colors as people in surgeons' coats were sitting with janitors and sitting with orderlies, often planning a fishing trip. There's no separation, one man said. Our kids play baseball together. They're in scouting together. There was no division by class in this place. And when we asked people who runs things around here, we kind of got blank looks, and people would think for a minute and then try to name a local business person or one of the women who was running a nonprofit, people who were investing in the community. So people from all across this northern New England community were involved in the community, serving on organizations like the hockey board or the running a scouts troop or even serving on the city council. So this mill area had what I called at the time strong civic culture. There was trust and cooperation, unlike in the poor communities. There was broad participation in community affairs, unlike in the poor communities. And there was investment in public institutions that served the whole community. A robust public life, you might say. And I attributed this strong civic culture to several things. To a large blue-collar middle class and its egalitarian ethos, as opposed to the heavy burden of long-term poverty in coal country and the Delta. To diverse ownership of businesses and land, as opposed to tightly held economic and land resources in Appalachia and the Delta. And to a history of respecting education and investing in community, especially educational institutions, as opposed to people looking after just their own family. Historically, of course, coal companies and plantation owners believed they needed to tightly control their workers, and they wanted cheap and compliant labor. They feared unions in the coal country, and they feared civil rights organizing in the Delta. They even had company stores where they issued credit so people would depend on them year-round. As you know, in the 40s and 50s, there was mechanization in both types of economies, and a huge outmigration to the factories of the Midwest and in the North. And some who stayed had coal jobs or good tractor driving jobs, but most scraped by on welfare or patched together odd jobs. Young people that we met from up in the hollows were often rough. They had a distinctive way of speaking, and they had little experience outside the isolated small sphere of family and work life. They often came to school dirty in hand-me-down clothes, and they were made fun of by other kids and treated badly by the teachers. Young people dropped out to work in the woods, the mines, the fields, and the few factories, or to take care of babies. There was an enormous education deficit for the poor. Now, when I did that work, I like to use the definition of Peter Townsend about poverty, that poverty is not having adequate resources to participate in the accepted ways of society. The poor are socially excluded and marginalized. Amartya Sen would say that the poor are those who are deprived of basic capabilities, deprived of the capacity to have good health, the capacity to be literate, deprived of the capacity, these capacities that are critical to participating in the mainstream, and as another development economist said, to leading healthy, creative lives. The word deprived seems to me to be very useful because it reminds us that poor families don't choose to be poorly educated or unhealthy. Development scholars Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen argue we should think of what people can do and can be, what they are capable of. And Nussbaum likes to say that supporting those capabilities requires affirmative material and institutional support, not simply, as neoliberals would have it, a failure to impede. They need more than a good attitude if they're going to achieve the American dream. They need material and cultural resources, and you get those resources through good public institutions and opportunities to mix with the non-poor. We saw that in Blackwell and Dahlia, the poor were left to chaotic, dysfunctional schools and not hired if they had a bad family name or had displeased a boss man. There were two societies living side by side, one that had the capacity to live a good life free of poverty, and the other mired in poverty and denied the institutional support that could build their capacity to participate in the workplace and in the community. So this February and March of 2013, with sociology graduate student Jessica Ulrich and my colleague, as I mentioned, Gemma Beckley, I returned to these three rural communities to see what changes have occurred. We also updated the appendix data, looking at a lot of census and other statistics, and Jess Carson helped enormously with that, carried it out, in fact. There have been a lot of changes. We interviewed about 40 people in each place, and so we really saw more about community change than we did about individuals, than getting individual stories. But just as we did, as I did in the first book, I tell this story and the analysis through people. I thought what I'd do is read you a couple of paragraphs from the beginning of each update and then talk to you about the changes. So when I wrote the book that was published in 1999, I called the first coal chapter Blackwell, Rigid Classes and Corrupt Politics in Appalachia's Coal Fields. The update title is Blackwell, Hunkering Down with Family. It is a crisp, cold morning in February 2013, and frost clings to the tufts of brown grass on the edge of the parking lot for the fast food restaurant where Gwen Bogg works. Gwen Boggs was a character in the first chapter. Nearly all the cars and trucks in the drive-through line and parked in the lot have Friends of Coal bumper stickers. Some have Friends of Coal license plates. The bubblegum dispenser just inside the door has a Friends of Coal sticker. These Friends of Coal are facing hard times. With recent coal mining layoffs, official unemployment in Blackwell is over 17%. But the unemployment rate does not convey the depth of the economic stagnation that defines the region. Only half of working-age men are employed, compared with 75% nationally. Fewer than 40% of working-age women are employed, compared to 2/3 nationally. 1/3 of families have no one working. 30% of young people 16 to 24 are idle, not in school and not working. Poverty is still very high. 1 in 3 are poor. And 40% are relying on food stamps or SNAP. Making a living is hard. If you want to stay in Blackwell and provide for your family, one woman told me, you just had to go to the mines. And as the mining jobs closed out, people began to leave, just as they did in the other Great Migration. And the ones that stayed behind have had to scrabble for whatever they can get. So jobs were scarce back in the 1990s, and they're scarce today. I think we figured out today that they've lost 7,000 people, and since I was there in the 20s, in the early 1990s, and jobs have gone down from 10,000 to 8,500. It's all a little messy because in order to disguise the places, statistically I averaged 2 neighboring counties, but these counties didn't follow the same trajectory. So in retelling the story, I'm using some real numbers from the place and hoping that the disguise sticks. So what you see in Blackwell today, and I have to confess that as I was leaving for Blackwell, I was really nervous because of calling out the people who were keeping the poor down in those early 1990s. And I had received a letter from the son of one of the coal operators that I feature in the book, and had not replied for fear of acknowledging that he was right, that I was in the county where his father was one of the families that ran things. But what we found when we got there, a lot of people talked with us. Jessica did a wonderful job of talking with people who were really struggling, and I mostly talked with people who were leaders of some kind, either educational leaders or political leaders or civic leaders. So over those 20 years, what we've seen is dramatic population decline as people left when jobs contracted. More and more polarization driven by these friends of coal outside interests that are trying to define, almost like they did in the old labor union conflicts, you're either for us or against us. You're either for coal or you're against coal. And if you're against coal, you're grouped in that, you're in that group because you are interested in talking about economic transition after coal, in talking about environmental protection so that you can bring more tourism in. A lot of people that we talked with have someone in their family doing what they call 312s, going to a city hours away and working 3 12-hour shifts, maybe living in a big apartment with other engineers or nurses, and then coming back to be at home. So there's a real tie, and many, many people talk to us about how family was the reason they stayed. Blackwell was the place that they knew, and that they were figuring out a way to be here. We heard still about the bad, poor families, and there were a lot of people who complained about dependency. Even though welfare reform has, of course, come, and you don't have thousands of women on welfare on AFDC, you now have TANF and just a few hundred families. But there's a lot of disability, there's a lot of reliance on food stamps, as we saw, and reliance on Medicaid. But one of the biggest changes that we saw was a pervasive painkiller addiction throughout the community. Every family has been touched by it, people told us. And now, when a teacher will ask a classroom how many have had a family member or know someone well who's addicted to painkillers, every single student will raise his or her hand. And now the family name issue is wrapped in with having a relative who's a felon. My dad was a drug addict. He stayed in trouble all the time, in and out of prison. My big brother was the same way, and my little brother's starting to get that way. Anywhere that would require me to reserve something in my last name, getting a haircut, the doctor's office, I couldn't do it. They wouldn't take me. A young man with good plumbing skills described the impact that drugs and a felony conviction had on him. I had drugs take everything I ever loved in my whole life away from me. My home, my truck, my bass boat, my four-wheelers, my guns, everything. And he was scandalized how you would live in Blackwell without your guns. And now I'm a convicted felon. I can't own no gun no more. I destroyed my family's name. I can't get a job nowhere. So the two big changes that we see in Blackwell are this radical outmigration and this devastating, pervasive painkiller addiction. But interestingly, the same families run things. Of course, there's been outmigration, not in-migration. And so the same families, although it's the next generation, control all the economic opportunities and all the land. And they still block new businesses, retirement homes, or a new super Walmart from coming in because it would cut into their control and their wealth and prosperity as the people who run things. People still say you don't want to cross them. There's a lot of politics here. If someone does not like you, you cannot get ahead and you have to leave. It's the same families, it's just a different generation. We thought maybe that the politics were a little better. The current county judge is from away and has been reelected 3 times, and he said that he went to see the magistrates right after he was elected, and he said, we're not going to distribute gravel according to how people voted anymore. We're going to do it according to what roads need gravel. But nonetheless, he says the schools are still corrupt and people get jobs there according to whether they're family members or how they voted. And this judge was framed by the sheriff appearing to take a bribe. He was acquitted of that, and then the sheriff was investigated by the county judge for apparently laundering and fooling around with some of the big drug money that's come in, money to help do drug deals and catch drug dealers. The county seat school still serves the professional families, and indeed everybody that we interviewed this year who was doing well had gone to that independent school, not to the county school. The county school is now a consolidated school, and it's this enormous campus, the most expensive high school ever built in the state. And it means that the teams are more competitive, which in a sports-loving region is important to people. The regional community college has become an important anchor institution. But I thought that the story of Johnny Bledsoe was particularly telling about both the way things, why things are staying so much the same and even getting worse. Johnny Bledsoe was, when I was there in the 90s, was in the state legislature. He's graduated from the independent county school in the 70s, went away to college and came back, was trying not to get sent to Vietnam. And he ended up getting a job at the community college, and then he decided, based on his gratitude for education loans that he'd received, to buck and depart from his parents' Republicanism and run for state rep as a Democrat. For 15 years, he served in the state legislature, and he worked hard on education because he really believed that the mountains and the coal regions were held back by the corruption in education. And so he set up an accountability office that would investigate schools that were not performing well and appeared corrupt. And he was instrumental in building the statewide reform. He also got involved in some coal issues because he had read an article actually by Jack Anderson about how strip mining was ruining one of the communities in his county and his district, and went to investigate and was scandalized. So although he had early on had support from the Cole family that runs things, that's among the handful that run things in Blackwell, when he spoke out against surface mining, and then when this accountability office investigated Blackwell schools and found a lot of people guilty of fraud and taking money and hiring people not according to merit, but according to who they knew and so forth. The school people and the coal people got together and they defeated him. And so here was a man who was prepared to make change and had a correct, in my view, analysis of what change required. But he was forced out of office, and he lives there now, even coaches Little League with some of the people who tried to get him out. As someone said, there's a lot of togetherness, and then there's kind of a rough and tumble about all this. So fundamentally what we found is this place that's really weighted down by poverty and by the drug problems and a complete lack of civic leadership that can muscle it out in any way. I've ground truthed all these chapters with people who live there, and including in this case with Johnny Bledsoe. And people don't like to hear the bad news, but they don't disagree with the conclusions. Now, my original title for the Delta place was Dahlia, Racial Segregation and Planter Control in the Mississippi Delta. The Dahlia update is entitled New Jobs and New Politics. And I'm just going to read a little bit again. These days, when you drive down Highway 44 from the airport nearest to Dahlia, you still travel through large, flat expanses of cotton, soy, and rice fields, and now some corn. The big farmers, who have received over $188 million in crop subsidies from the federal government since we were last here, flood their fields in the winter to attract duck hunters, and the low water shimmers on this gray winter morning. There are rumors that the powerful Regional Commission of Business Leaders wants to turn more of the Yazoo Delta into hunting preserves and retirement developments catering to upper-income whites, and they would like to see poor blacks leave for northern cities. Certainly there are more hunting areas. Uncultivated stretches of low shrubs and trees that attract wildlife for hunters are evident in a neighboring county, and a local state representatives have been surprised to hear that their white colleagues in the capital often come here for hunting on weekends. There have never been workers in the field in February, and when even tractor drivers are idle and rely on unemployment and other public assistance until planting season. But now locals tell us that in the heart of the growing season, you no longer see the cotton chopping crews, water jugs in hands, going after weeds with their hose. The road has been expanded to 4 lanes to accommodate visitors to the huge casino operations that emerge from the fields like a mirage in the western part of the county. Neon lights flash glitz, and billboards advertise coming performers and special deals for seniors. Signs of urban life on an otherwise barren agricultural landscape covered with last season's dead stalks. Dahlia and its surrounding communities have become one of the country's largest gambling destinations, providing employment for locals and those from nearby cities and towns, and attracting gamblers from a 3-state region and beyond. So the impact of these casinos has been profound and complex. Poverty has gone down from 60 to 30%. The county has received almost $50 million in revenue every year for the last 18 years. At first, the casinos hired widely. They needed dealers and bartenders. They needed housekeepers and dishwashers. You could have a household where you might have a mom and 2 daughters and their children living on $8,000 a year in public assistance. And now if those 2 daughters go clean rooms in one of the casinos, the household has $36,000. So things dramatically have changed in the economy. And there are more jobs in Dahlia than there are adults in Dahlia. But they haven't been able to hire and keep everybody hired. They hired a tremendous amount of people from Dahlia when they first got here. They could gain employment, but maintaining and keeping employment, you have people who had only worked in the catfish industry, or at the compress doing seasonal work, or in agriculture doing flat-out farm labor. How is it possible for those people to get into the casino industry and maintain their job without any training? There was no way our people could be successful. Black leaders with whom we talked deplored the missed opportunities to build the life skills and work habits of these potential workers who did not know to bathe, to refrain from dipping snuff, or to call when a sick child kept them from getting to work. Now, those who could hold jobs have settled into their jobs, and some are living in a nearby county where schools are better and where there's more middle-class housing. But what about all this revenue? There's a regional airport, there's a museum and a huge arena to host events to draw in tourists. There's a big new county administration building and a new jail. And just as in Blackwell, although I failed to mention it, there are police cars everywhere. There's a large recreation center and with courts and ballparks and swimming pool. Black leaders deplored the lack of cooperation between blacks and whites. Trillions of dollars thrown away and nobody knows where it is. Now we're struggling because the casinos are struggling. We never could sit at the table with the white to make our community better. They pointed out the black neighborhoods, which indeed it had struck us, looked exactly the same 20 years later. Dilapidated housing and broken down cars and burned out buildings and bad roads, teenagers hanging out on corners with their hoods pulled up, stray dogs roaming in packs. One guy said to me, if intentions were to improve the quality of life, when we first got this money, when you came back here, the old town wouldn't be looking like that. You understand what I'm saying? So one of the big changes, obviously, is the casinos and the huge number of jobs and the cutting of poverty in half. Enormous change. But also, in 2012, the political leadership shifted from white majority to an all-black county supervisor board. So these county supervisors oversee all that revenue. And for the first 18 years, that revenue, except for the recreation center, was largely put into things that benefited whites, into the airport, into the roads out by the farms. The downtown county seat, which was majority, almost all white when I was there, now there are a few black families, had put up little cute street signs and got a carillon, is that how you say it, clock, that was an enormous clock in the downtown. But the black neighborhoods looked exactly the same. But several things happened to ensure this political turnover. For one thing, of course, the casinos have diluted the economic power that the planters had over the workers because now there are choices, and these casinos are hiring blacks and whites for the same jobs. So it's been an enormous change, diluting that power of the white farmers. The white farmers made sure they benefit, and there have been some rifts because the local newspaper called out some of the shady deals that were going on with the white farmers. But the main thing is that the voters now can vote the way they want to without feeling they could be fired or punished by the white planters. And a lot of the younger voters never have worked on the farms. As I said in that part that I read, the field work has been dramatically reduced. So in 2012, the people who were running for office, the blacks who were running for office, kind of took a page out of Obama's campaign and did a lot of grassroots organizing and registering of voters. But they also benefited from years and years of political organizing that blacks had done, especially working with young people. And they also benefited from the statewide leadership of other politicians who were black, both national and state level politicians, who coached and nurtured these local politicians and helped them figure out a strategy for winning the votes. In a neighboring county where we spent a day doing interviews, the black leadership kept getting defeated, and they were pretty sure it had to do with absentee voting ballots that were being moved around and handled illegally. And there was implications that that had once been the case in Dahlia, but was no longer. So one of the big things that happened in that same election is that they decisively elected a new, dynamic, change-minded young school superintendent. And this new school superintendent is determined to not just hire people that he knows or people who have always had the jobs, but to hire people who can deliver results. And he's having a little trouble with the school board, who are hearing from their constituents who don't like being taken off the summer school teaching list or something like that. There's more integration than there was 20 years ago, but there's still a lot of racism in the recreation center that people had hoped would be a place where black and white kids would go together is entirely black. The recreation center is large and serves a lot of children, but in many ways it's like the jobs at the casino. So you can get jobs at the casino if you bring those life skills and understanding of how to work, the ability, the cultural resources to participate in the workplace and in society. But if you don't, as we saw, you're back home and on aid or depending on family members. Similarly, the children whose parents go to the small churches and hear about the opportunities at the recreation center, who have a way to get to the recreation center programs, can go and maybe their aunt or their grandma can get together the little bit of money they need to go to the programs. But a lot of children are latchkey children who don't have those rides and are missed by the recreation programs. And one guy said, if a mother is working and she got 4 kids, she can't participate. You got to transport those kids, keep them out of trouble. For children, you really have to go and get them. So I'll move on to the New England community, but I would say that I think this new black leadership is momentous, and that we may see now, as we anticipated and speculated about 20 years ago, investment in poor black families and their children. Gray Mountain's original chapter was entitled Equality and Civic Involvement in Northern New England, and the update is entitled Holding On to a Blue-Collar Community. Snow is starting to fall as we creep down the steep hill into Gray Mountain and make our way through the town on this early March morning. Unlike 20 years ago, the mill's rotten egg smell is gone and the air looks and smells clean. After a series of owners and repeated shutdowns and reopenings, the large paper and pulp mill operation in the heart of town closed for good in the mid-2000s. The heart of Gray Mountain was the pulp mill and the paper machine that was there. That was devastating when it closed. That was a shock to everyone. Everyone figured it would happen one day, but it happened abruptly. And the community understood how permanent the shutdown was when the Canadian owner dismantled it completely, with the exception of one valuable boiler that the city persuaded the company to spare. This is worth more than scrap steel. Make sure it's the last thing you tear down and give us a year or two. The boiler became the focus of a wrenching debate about the identity of Gray Mountain. There were some, including the mayor and several on the city council at the time, who wanted to change the area's image. Gray Mountain would transition to a new economy based on tourism, maybe expand the community college to be a 4-year college. When the mill closed, someone said, the smell was gone. It was a chance to rebuild Gray Mountain away from an industrial place and to emphasize the natural beauty, an opportunity to reinvent itself and attract commercial development to the riverfront. As the recession hit, though, they came to believe what many were urging, that it was better to go with something more solid that they had already, which was that boiler. And that boiler became the subject of a really wrenching debate about the identity of the place and its future growth and development. And in a new election, a mayor was elected who challenged the tourism and recreation image for the place, and instead pushed for the biomass plant to be built right downtown. And indeed, as we arrived, there were hundreds of workers building this huge plant right in the middle of town. When we got there in March, 2 long-standing manufacturing businesses that had treated workers really well had just gone bankrupt, and people had said that morale was pretty low. The area has 2 new prisons, like many rural communities that are trying to make a transition, and one small specialty paper mill that an outside national investor has bought. They've built an ambitious ATV and snowmobile riding project, and they even let those ATVs come right downtown. But a really big thing that happened there, and everybody we met with wanted us to know about this right away. When the housing values collapsed after the mill shut down, a huge number, everybody said, of low-income households moved in to take advantage of the cheaper rents. Again, something that's fairly common in rural America. People saw that these double and triple deckers that used to house multi-generations of blue-collar families were turning into troubled neighborhoods with poverty, high poverty, like in the Delta and coal country. Everyone worried about this influx and its impact on the community. One person said, they come here and they sleep all day and raise hell all night. They have children who are a product of that lifestyle. They get coded in your school system. We were spending $80,000 to $100,000 per kid because these kids had learning disabilities because of the way they were brought up. It wasn't just a threat. The situation was real, and we're cleaning up that mess. Those people aren't welcome here. Of course, this is my place with lots of civic culture and community investment. But they did work hard to clean up the housing. They hired a housing director. They even changed some state laws so that they could go after slum landlords' other properties if they weren't doing right by the properties in Gray Mountain. So they made some very self-conscious choices to stay a blue-collar community. They put that biomass plant right in the middle of the city rather than taking a more gentrified path. They invested in ATV trails, and they took down the bad housing to avoid the blight of a large poverty population. They don't particularly like the idea of a prison economy, but on the other hand, these are new jobs. And if you look statistically, the jobs are virtually the same today as they were 20 years ago. They're just not as good jobs, and median income is way down. One person said, "When I grew up here, we were a strong middle-class community. Everybody worked and everybody looked out for each other. My uncles and my dad's friends were Boy Scout leaders. They were hockey coaches. They were Little League coaches. My generation did the same, and younger parents are doing the same." And even though there was this criticism of the poor households who were moving in, we talked to a number of school personnel at all different levels, and it appeared that they were wrapping the children into their schools, providing support services, even had special efforts to get the parents who weren't used to coming to school events to come to school events. So Gray Mountain is adjusting to a new economy and new demographics. It's lost a lot of its 30 and 40-somethings, and there are more older residents. But nonetheless, its population is dedicated to the community and maintaining that community that they have, since I was there 20 years ago, valued and invested in. Blackwell, of course, has lost so many jobs with coal in decline and high poverty, and without any civic leadership, the future really looks dim. When I wrote Worlds Apart 20 years ago, and was turning to policy questions, I argued that we should at least push to get all the schools to work. The fact that those kids were in Blackwell and Dahlia were in bad schools seemed to be a big part of the problem and something we could actually do. And a lot of people subsequently in classrooms who have used the book, I think, thought I was talking about No Child Left Behind, which of course I wasn't. But I think that today we know a lot more about what policies work, but really the debate isn't that different. And just as I quoted Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen about capabilities and investing in institutions that build those capabilities, I think we have more evidence than ever that we need public institutions and public investment to reach out to poor children. If you look at the American school system today and you look at how children do if you don't include the poor children, we do as well as any school in the world, any school system in the world. And so what I conclude in this update is how political poverty is, that people were making decisions in Blackwell not to bother to invest in those poor families and country schools. People clearly, the whites, even when they had all that revenue to invest, did not put it into the schools because those were black schools and they were looking after their own families. In Gray Mountain, one of the reasons that people have been able to maintain that community is because they're committed to public education and everybody goes to one school. So those from poor families mix it up and get integrated into the mix and acquire those cultural and material resources that they need to participate and to achieve upward mobility. And I'll just close by mentioning this recent study that some Harvard and Berkeley economists have done that you may have seen highlighted in the New York Times recently in the summer, that showed that place matters. Oh, yes, we knew that. But that places where there's investment in policies that help stabilize and support poor families and that allow families, poor children, to mix it up with middle-class families, do indeed achieve much greater upward mobility. And places where there's great inequality and the poor are separated from the non-poor, end up being mired in poverty and don't achieve that upward mobility. And I think that those results are parallel the results that we see both 20 years ago and this past year in these three communities. So I'll stop there. I don't even know what time it is and take some questions.
much, Mel. Here we go. Thank you so much, Mel. We're taping this for folks who are across the country and asked us to be able to use it in their classroom, including Jessica, so you can wave to her in her classroom. But wait for the mic if you have a question so that we can get it on the audio. Do we have any questions from the audience? Stand and say your name.
Okay. Sure. Hi, my name's Sharon. I had two questions. One was whether you saw drug, either prescription drug or crystal meth in the other towns that you saw. And the other was, did you have any idea whether the people who decided to go made the good choice, did better elsewhere, or were they poor elsewhere?
Good questions. Yes, we saw drugs in the other places, but nothing like the pervasiveness that we saw in Blackwell. In fact, it was one of the guys I talked with in the Delta said, who was a coach who had a bad football injury, said he was coming out of the pharmacy and one of his former players said, "I know you just got some painkillers, coach. Can you sell me some?" But mostly it was still pretty invisible there. Meth gets a lot of publicity, but it doesn't touch so many families. And Carsey did a study not too long ago that showed, using national data, that although meth is, big on the TV screens, really alcohol and painkillers are the drugs that mostly are scourges for these communities. But it was way worse in Blackwell than it was. Some of the police talked about painkillers, especially among these newcomers who had moved in, who are low income up in the New England Mill community. But again, nothing like the pervasive problems in Blackwell. What was your second question?
About whether the people who left.
Oh, whether people who left did better, right?
Made a choice that maybe they didn't want to make, but that benefited them, or did they went just somewhere else poor?
Right. It's a good question. I don't have good empirical data. Most of those we talked to who had relatives who left described relatives who had good jobs, and someone even described a case where a young man was on disability. But he married a young woman who wanted to go back to Arizona, and when he got out there, he found a job, and so he stopped being on disability. So we don't, we have anecdotes, but I don't feel like I have good data on that. Yeah.
So you talked in these communities about increased police presence in one, and in, I believe it was Dahlia and Gray Mountain, the increase in prisons. And I wonder if you can talk about that from two perspectives. One, jobs that might be available, and also whether there was increased policing of the poor.
Okay, good questions. So in both the poor communities, in Blackwell and in Dahlia, we saw police cars everywhere we went. In Blackwell, these were cars that were bought through a combination of Homeland Security, if you can believe it, money, and coal severance tax money. And a lot of people described abuse by the police, being stopped for no reason, being forced to do a test to see whether they were on drugs and then arrested anyhow. Others would complain that the police let drug deals go on right under their nose. So the police were there. It's a good job to get, especially in a place with so little jobs. In Dahlia, of course, a lot of the revenue has gone into police and a new jail, partly because the casinos do bring somewhat more crime, but it didn't seem like that much crime was affecting this particular community. Again, it was a good job. Policemen described being able to take their cars home. They had all the latest equipment. So it's a part of an economy of the public sector that is kind of by default if they can get the revenue to pay for the people. The prisons are more of a mixed question. They're hidden back in the woods. The federal prison will only hire people 35 and younger. So that's good in that it means new people will be coming in, new families. The state prison hired a lot of the mill workers who were laid off. people didn't feel like they'd seen any increase. Prisoners aren't released right there in that community. They're taken back to their home community to be released. And so, really, I think those who said the prisons would bring middle-class jobs, even though they aren't great, were right. It's a reasonable way to try to maintain a community and have jobs if you're living there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Charlene Baxter.
Hi, Charlene.
I have a question about 20 years ago when you were in Dahlia. Were casinos on the drawing board as a discussion item introduced at that point?
Yes, yes, they were. They were just starting to come, and I did not talk about them because I thought it would identify where I was at the time. And when I first contemplated the update, I thought, well, what'll I do instead of casinos that'll have this huge impact? But it was just it's too particular, so I had to describe this huge influx. There are about, I forget now, 9 or 11 casinos, and big ones from Las Vegas, all the big name ones that you'd recognize. They're located in the northwest part of the county so that they're relatively close to a metropolitan area where you fly into. And, but nobody that we talked to, including the sisters who have a prominent role in working with the black community and the poor, thought that the casinos were anything but a great thing for Dahlia. It was unanimous. Yeah, well, she's...
Hi, Ryan Lawrence. Has any of your research focused or shed any light into a potential green economy that could sort of kind of boost, I guess, the infrastructure there, as well as potentially offering jobs to people that may not have the adequate education to go into other professions?
It's a really good question. It's certainly the big hope of everybody. I would say that, in some ways the biomass plant is a green effort, and certainly in both Blackwell, the coal place, and the mill town, this work to build ATV trails, and in the case of Blackwell, a zip line, and to clean up the rivers is oriented towards recreation and amenity-based tourism. I think it'll work in the northern New England mill place. I don't think it'll make a big dent in spite of all the earnest efforts in Blackwell, because they've still got over 30% of the people living in poverty, this tremendous problem of drug addiction. A lot of kids are living with their grandparents there because the parents are either in jail or strung out on pills. So the social problems in Blackwell are so great. And it doesn't come up much in the Delta because people are looking at the casinos. They've got 2 plants that are, one promised and one just barely started. And one of those is to make a green car. But again, it seems small compared to all the other forces that are a factor.
I'm Bill Maddox from the Carsey Institute.
Hey, Bill.
This may be a difficult question, but I'm just curious, when you had the chance to go back to these communities, I imagine that even though you have kind of obscured the identities and the locations, if you're a political leader in the local or state or federal level, you probably know exactly which communities the book was talking about. That's my assumption. And I was just wondering if in your kind of revisiting the issues in these communities, if you ran into people who were positively or even negatively influenced by what they read. Was anybody moved to challenge some of the corruption or some of the disenfranchisement or just the order of things that had been there for decades and decided to do something different?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Actually, in the Delta and the coal country, the leaders had not read the book, which was good. It was one reason I was so throwing up on the day I was to take my plane to Blackwell. I was so afraid that they would have. But I mean, of course, the son of the coal operator had read it. But I don't think it had any impact. It's widely used in the community college classrooms. And the regional community college, one of the professors, said, Mill Duncan was back and was updating her chapter on boop boop, and oh, yikes. But I would say that people whom we interviewed who knew the book saw it as accurate then and saw the conditions as fundamentally the same today, this year, in Blackwell. In Dahlia, it was really good that people hadn't read the book. It enabled me to speak with some whites who were very candid and would have been way cautious if they'd read the book. Those that I interviewed, in each place I interviewed people whom I'd interviewed before as well as new people, but not always people who knew the book. I will say that in the northern New England community, one of my former students was teaching the book in a class, and one of her students called his dad up in Gray Mountain and said, Dad, this is about us. And so the dad read the book and then called his good friend whom I feature in the book and used his name from the book. He says, Sean McKay, and he said, who's this, And he said that it never occurred to him, this father, until he read the book, that people didn't treat each other equally and well wherever they were. The fact that conditions were the way they were in the Delta and Appalachia was a big surprise to him. And he went on to give me a great anecdote, contemporary anecdote of a case at a big Christmas party where the prosecutor and the judge and the defendant and the defendant's lawyer were all having a beer together, and they had their particular ranks, of course, but they were able to talk and get along, which, for him was contemporary validation of what I had described 20 years earlier. I mean, I've had a lot of people who live in Appalachia and the Delta tell me that those chapters rang true in the old days. And as I say, when I ground truthed this update with people, they felt we got it right. But I certainly would not presume that I've had any impact on organizing. I mean, people are organizing because they believe in it, because it's what they do when they get up in the morning. Those black organizers that 20 years ago were trying to give kids something to do and get them off the streets, a lot of those kids are the ones that have the jobs in the casinos or some of the support industries. And two of these black organizers who are now grandfathers got all choked up talking about kids that they'd coached coming back and telling them what a difference they made in their lives. But, that's who those guys are, and certainly it's a great privilege to meet them and be able to tell their story, but I don't think the book has had any impact that way, nor could, really. If I had my druthers, it would be that we'd get at least talking about inequality again and investing in public institutions.
Ken Johnson.
Hey, Ken.
Do the casinos as an institution have any impact on the community? I mean, I know they create a lot of jobs, but do they institutionally do anything to try and improve the situation in the county?
Well, that's a really good question. While we were there in Dahlia, there was a food bank that the sisters had organized, and they organized it right in the middle of the white downtown to sort of remind people that there's still a lot of need. And people who were helping to put together the bags of food that this long trail of old cars was coming around the square to pick up were from the casinos. So they had, Harrah's on their T-shirt, and they were volunteers who were doing some work. But that was the extent of what we saw. They're outside owned. They appear to try to, in spite of the black organizers' lament, they appear to try to be fair in who they hire. And a number of the people, blacks as well as whites, who were doing medium well had children or relatives who were working in those casinos. But I don't think they, except for this, sort of traditional food bank-like charity, get involved that much. And because they don't have to live in Dahlia proper, they can live in a neighboring county where there's more better schools and more housing available for the middle class and less segregation. They don't have that kind of neighborhood sense as the black organizers do.
Sally Ward, Carsey in sociology. So there's a lot of discussion about casinos as an economic development strategy, including here in New Hampshire, Gray Mountain. And you said that all of the people you interviewed in Dahlia, to the person, were advocates of what had happened. And I wonder what your take is, knowing what you know now about the impact of casinos. Do you agree with them that it's a good economic development strategy?
No, but I think it has been very good for Dahlia, a place where 80% of blacks were poor 20 years ago, and huge proportions of people couldn't read or write. If Blackwell could get a casino, I'd say do it. But I don't think a prosperous, diverse economy such as ours should mess with it. And there's, as you guys know, if you go into any casino, but we had to stay at the casino because it was the only other hotel is a place of prostitution. And, it's just depressing. And, just people in such spending their money, all the stuff that everybody knows. So, no, it's not a good strategy. But if that revenue can be turned, it's interesting because I think in all three cases, you get a snapshot 20 years later, but you so want to know, well, what's going to happen in the next 5 years, because this political leadership, can they do something in Dahlia? In Blackwell, is it really going to keep just heading south and going downhill? I think so. And then, I guess really Dahlia is the biggest mystery because things are still pretty bad there. Poverty's as high as it is in Blackwell, even with all these jobs. So there's an enormous challenge to overcome the education deficit especially.
I think we have time for just one more question.
All right, Larry Hamilton, this will be change of pace. You're describing coming back to these communities and how you see things have changed and other things have not have changed. But one of the things that would have changed is in the meantime, you've been all over the world and done many other things. And I wondered if you, to some extent, saw things differently coming back, if your perspective had changed. You've seen some of these movies elsewhere and other sorts of additional dimensions you brought to it.
No, that's a good question, and it's something that one of the peer reviewers from the press has observed. I guess, let me just say that analytically, my perspective has changed. Whereas I thought that a vibrant middle class and civic culture was the answer, I think it's the outcome of a political economy and of the way the economy is tightly controlled and therefore the politics is tightly controlled. So the good civil culture in Gray Mountain is not like a mechanism to have a good community. It's the outcome of a better political system, more openness, more democratic participation, accountability, and then related, I give much more consideration to the weight of poverty in Blackwell and Dahlia. It's so hard. I mean, to your question, there are people trying to build a green economy, but it's so hard when you've got so much dependency, when a third of the families in Blackwell don't have any worker, when a third of the working age people say they have a work-related disability. Yeah, I mean, it's just this very heavy blanket of hard times that, so my students used to say when we were doing the work originally, what if we brought the business leaders and the women who were building great nonprofits to solve teen pregnancy and everything down to Blackwell? What would happen? And, my answer to them then and still would be that it's the structural issues, not the individual's character, but they're intertwined. You get used to having your way and being, and the community lets you do that. But I think the weight of the problems and the poverty is such that it's really, really hard to make change unless you have these huge casinos come in, and how likely is that, right? And even then, 18 years in those 2 black neighborhoods looked exactly the same. And 90% of the kids in the public school are on free and reduced lunch, so it's really, really hard. I think I do give more, to your point about my other work in the last 20 years and the opportunities I had both on our study and in the Ford Foundation work to travel and see poor communities, that the institutions I still think matter, but maybe even more. And I think the tie between investing in institutions and politics is stronger than I even thought then. So, I really believe and argue in the conclusion that, to the update, that, this poverty is political. It's choices we're making about how to invest and how to distribute resources. And I think we do that nationally, and they do it in these communities, we do it in the state, and so that political dimension. And I think that I quote Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum and Mahbub ul Haq, who I first met in my dissertation 100 years ago, because I think that the development economists are the right analysts to be thinking about poverty, at least in rural America, because it does have this political dimension. DFID just put out the British version of USAID, just put out a report about how much politics and participation, but the nature of politics and whether they're corrupt or not, can impede development. And I think that's what we're seeing,
If there's other questions, or Michelle's trying to talk.
Let's get one more in. Michelle Dullen, sociology. Mill, you've done obviously a beautiful job showing the micro-level factors and the local contextual specifics that impact poverty. And as you rightly say, poverty is politics, both locally, nationally, and of course transnationally. It's several decades since Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, and still here we are, 2013 already. Mm-hmm. Poverty hasn't gone away. Yes, there has been a reduction, but the chronically high, the figures of such chronically high and persistent poverty, which Carsey, among other institutes, documents, what are the impediments at the national level? And we've had Republican and we've had Democratic administrations. Mm-hmm. Why are Americans so willing to accept such high levels of poverty? That's asking you to go beyond your data, but I think that's a question you can answer.
Well, I think the same thing I thought when I taught political sociology here, that there are, reasons rooted in our political culture that lead us away from believing in the effectiveness of public investment, whether it's in early childhood education or giving up local control of schools, or I just feel like everybody in this room must have the same picture I do of what the answer to your question is, that in spite of really good evidence that there's even a return on investment that outweighs the investment in early childhood education or in providing mental health resources and financial support to low-income families so that they can be more stable. We don't make those investments, and our counterparts in many other developed countries do and have far lower poverty. I think some of it is, a kind of residential segregation. I think it is, I believe these analyses that say that it's more about socioeconomic divisions than about racial divisions in this economy. Although we saw in Dahlia an interesting potential banding together based on race to address poverty. But it's that's a very extreme place. So I think that we battle this as we are today. I mean, if you look at the state of North Carolina right now, they're very conservative Tea Party activists are uninvesting in education in that state. And that when I started this update back in January, I was carrying around this great book about when North Carolina and the leadership there invested in public education, higher education, and all down the way. and with enormous results. They got a middle class in North Carolina when it was a poor, largely rural place. They built the research, all that stuff, but now they're dismantling it. So, I think it's they are ideological reasons, obviously not empirical, based on empirical data. What do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, the liberals, we don't want casinos, right? As Sally pointed out. But as you said, it have the poverty in at least one community. Now, I personally am not advocating casinos, but this is the problem with these policy discussions is, the liberal democratic politics wants high-paying jobs, but we're living in a world where those jobs are no longer available because of globalization and other forces. So sometimes I think if I were even in Grey Mountain, I'd vote in favor of casinos because it can bring in good jobs. That's a separate issue. The other comment which I would say, and it goes to your structural point, which I personally totally think sociologically is correct, but there's also the issue of human agency. And I think when people, particularly those who are opposed to more permissive, if you like, policy options or to invest in education, they'll say, well, we are investing in early childhood education and we're doing all this pro-family, mental and physical health. But then subsequently, these people make choices that increase poverty, whether it's children out of wedlock, whether it's drugs. I mean, these are all the things that people don't like to talk about in public if they're liberals. And yet I think we have to address those issues because the actual data gives fuel to all of those on the right who oppose intervention, because there is a culture of dependency, however we want to call it. So I think, obviously it's a very depressing problem. There's certainly some good news in your visits. But the overarching, I think there has to be a total paradigm shift in terms of American public policy debates about poverty.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And in all three of these places, but especially in Blackwell and Dahlia, there were so many complaints about dependency, and even very progressive people. Even Johnny Bledsoe, my hero, was, it's just, and there aren't big welfare checks anymore. These people are, as that great NPR and whatever it was, I forget who else was involved, that study that showed how much disability has become our default social policy, and it's certainly the case in Blackwell and to some degree in Dahlia. These are blue-collar people who are illiterate, who don't have skills for today, and if there aren't jobs there, and even if they move, what are they going to do? To your question. So, but I do believe that dependency and behavior does not, it has to recognizing it, and it's interesting that people who live with it criticize it, but on the other hand, they get there because there's no investment in the families, in the early, all this new research that shows how important the 0 to 5 time is, and just it seems so compelling. There are states that are investing in early childhood education, and that new Harvard and Berkeley economist study is an important validation of policies that invest to stabilize poor families, and the New Hope project that Greg Duncan worked on. So, on that cheerful note.
On that cheerful note, please join me in thanking Mill one more time.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you back here, both personally and professionally, I think, for everyone here. So I know people want to visit with you. We have a light reception outside the door that Sue has been guarding. So please join us there. Also, don't forget, if you're not, make sure you're on Carsey's mailing lists later this week. Beth and Jess and Andrew will have the latest child poverty analysis numbers from this week's census data. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll be the first to know about our analysis. Beth mentioned the next two talks in the series, which are also online, and we'll remind you of those as they come closer. So thanks again for coming, everyone, today, and please join us outside.